Welcome to my little corner of truth. I've always believed that family is supposed to be a shelter, a warm place where you feel safe, even when the world is cold. I never imagined that the people I love most could be the ones to deliver the sharpest sting. I'm 68 now, and I've seen plenty of things in life, but nothing quite like the day I overheard my daughter laughing on speakerphone about finally being free from my $350,000 retirement fund. It started innocently enough. I had moved into a small, cozy apartment after retiring, a place filled with the smell of old wood and the faint aroma of the coffee I drink every morning. My daughter had promised to check in regularly, make sure I had everything I needed. At first it felt good, comforting even. The phone calls, the visits, little gestures like dropping off homemade cookies or helping with laundry. I trusted her completely. $350,000 was a tidy sum. But I wasn't rich. It was my security for these years when my body didn't move like it used to. Then the little signs began. The first time I noticed something odd, I brushed it off. A missed call, an email unanswered, a small discrepancy in my account. I remember staring at my computer screen, the faint hum of the heater in the background, the smell of my old leather chair pressing against me, thinking, maybe I'm just being paranoid. But deep down, there was a knot in my stomach I couldn't shake. A week later, it happened. I had left my phone on the kitchen counter while I went to wash the dishes, and that's when I heard it. Her voice, laughing, carefree, utterly heartless, talking to someone I didn't know. Finally, she said, "We're free from his money. $350,000, gone. No strings attached." My hands froze under the warm water. I could feel the heat from the sink, the faint scent of lemon from the soap, but nothing could touch the cold that ran down my spine. For a moment, I questioned myself. Did I hear that right? My daughter, my own flesh and blood, speaking about my life savings as if it were a prize she'd won. I listened a little longer, hoping against hope that I had misunderstood. But the laughter, cruel, bright, ringing, left no room for doubt. I sat down at my worn kitchen table, the scratches on its surface familiar like old scars, and I thought about all the times I had trusted her, driving me to appointments, helping with groceries, reminding me to take my medicine. Everything had been a performance, a carefully staged act of filial love, and here I was, realizing that it was all a lie. I didn't confront her immediately. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers, to feel some sort of immediate justice. But I was also old enough to know that fire alone rarely fixes anything. Instead, I watched quietly, tracing the faint digital footprints she'd left behind, listening for patterns, small hints that would tell me just how deep this betrayal went. And that's when I started planning, not out of anger alone, but out of necessity. Sometimes, to protect what's yours, you have to play a patient game. The next few days were tense. I kept my routine, the smell of coffee and old books grounding me, while secretly tracking every transaction, every hint of movement from her side. I won't lie. The anxiety gnawed at me. Nights were the worst. The creak of my old floorboards sounded louder than usual. The hum of the heater became a constant reminder that I was alone in this fight. I thought about my late wife, how she would have warned me, how she would have seen through the smiles and the sweet words. She always had that intuition, that quiet wisdom I sometimes envy in hindsight. Then came the micro-twist, the little mistake she didn't think anyone would notice. She had left a draft email on her computer, a slip-up, a digital breadcrumb. The subject line alone made my heart sink. Plan for Dad's retirement fund. I opened it carefully, trying not to breathe too loudly, and saw the details of her scheme. Dates, amounts, even mentions of accomplices I hadn't met. It was meticulous, but the arrogance of leaving it exposed gave me leverage I hadn't expected. The betrayal was painful, yes, but also strangely empowering. I realized that knowledge, cold, hard facts, could be as much of a weapon as anger. I spent the next morning walking slowly down to the park, the crisp air biting at my cheeks, the smell of wet leaves reminding me that the world still had ordinary beauty outside of my personal hell. I reflected on choices, on how trust can be both a blessing and a curse. I wasn't sure what I would do yet, confront her directly, involve a lawyer, or perhaps take a subtler route that allowed me to reclaim control without burning bridges entirely. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. Not by her, not by the world, and certainly not by myself. The morning after discovering that draft email, I felt a strange mixture of betrayal and clarity. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich bitterness grounding me, while the smell of toasted bread filled my small apartment. It was ordinary, domestic, comforting, a stark contrast to the storm raging in my mind. I sat at the table, staring at the screen of my laptop, rereading every line of her careless admission. Every detail, every name, every amount. $350,000, my life savings, carefully mapped out for her freedom, and she had thought no one would ever see it. I spent hours retracing her steps, looking for patterns, watching her digital footprints with the patience of someone who'd learned over decades that impatience is the enemy of justice. She was meticulous, yes, but arrogant. Her ego had betrayed her. I found emails to friends, texts that mentioned dates, amounts, even plans for purchases, all of which she thought were secret. Each one landed in my mind like the tick of a clock, a reminder that time was mine to use wisely, even if I felt powerless emotionally. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I chose quiet observation. There's a peculiar sort of revenge in knowing, in holding a secret that the other person believes is still theirs to manipulate. I started leaving small, subtle tests, transfers that were smaller than the usual withdrawals, messages I knew she would read but never respond to directly. I wanted to see how she would react, how far she would go believing she was untouchable. The tension was almost delicious, like the taste of a well-brewed coffee lingering on my tongue, bitter, grounding, invigorating. Then came the first escalation. One afternoon, I received a call from her bank, not directly from her, but from a clerk, someone polite yet firm, asking for clarification about a series of unusual withdrawals. I hadn't called anyone. She had. She had made a mistake, leaving a paper trail that would eventually reach me. I could almost hear her laugh in my mind as she thought she was clever. The smell of the paper in my hands, the click of the pen as I signed forms to authorize certain transactions, the faint hum of the air conditioner, all of it became part of this tense symphony of quiet power and imminent reckoning. It was during one of these tests that I discovered the first real emotional micro-twist. She wasn't acting alone. There was a friend involved, someone she trusted to help execute the plan, and, of course, they had underestimated me. Small digital breadcrumbs left behind, a misfiled email, a copied address, revealed the complicity I hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, this wasn't just a betrayal by a daughter. It was a small conspiracy, and my choices had to expand beyond merely confronting her. This required strategy, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. I remembered something my wife used to say. The loudest threat often hides the smallest courage. I took that to heart as I began crafting my own quiet countermeasures. I contacted my lawyer, an old friend who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and books, and explained the situation without letting on that I had already pieced together most of the plan. His eyebrows rose, not in surprise, but in professional acknowledgement. We started building a framework, not just legal, but emotional. The kind of slow, deliberate moves that ensure your opponent doesn't even realize the chessboard is tilted against them until the final move. Days turned into a week, and every interaction with her was a careful dance. I kept my tone calm, my words measured. She would call, her voice honeyed and familiar, asking about appointments, meals, medicine. I responded with warmth, masking the storm inside. Every laugh, every joke, every casual remark she made about her life or mine became data. The small scrape of her fingernails against the counter, the faint scent of perfume she wore to mask stress. Every detail registered in my mind. I wasn't just preparing for confrontation. I was gathering truth, building leverage, and teaching myself patience I didn't know I had left. Then the micro-twist that I hadn't predicted. One of her friends, who had been reluctantly complicit, reached out to me. A brief phone call, hesitant, fearful, almost apologetic. They admitted small things, details of conversations, minor discrepancies, and hints of guilt. This humanized the betrayal in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't purely malicious. Not entirely. There was fear, there was pressure, there was a sense of being trapped by circumstance. But even so, the betrayal remained, sharp and bitter, like a thin slice of lemon on the tongue. Sharp enough to sting, but oddly awakening. With this new information, I crafted a plan that was not about anger alone, but about reclaiming control. Quiet legal moves intertwined with subtle emotional nudges. A carefully worded letter here, a gentle reminder of my oversight there, a suggestion that certain funds were being watched. Nothing overt, nothing that would escalate immediately, but enough to make her nervous. The balance of power was shifting, invisibly, subtly, almost imperceptibly. By the end of the week, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow, pride, and relief. Sorrow for the betrayal itself, the laughter, the casual disregard for what I had trusted her with, but pride in my ability to navigate it with dignity, and relief, strange as it sounds, in knowing that my patience, my quiet observation, and my understanding of human flaws had placed me in a position where I controlled the next move. The $350,000 wasn't safe yet, but my mind was. My dignity was intact. And sometimes that's the first victory, even before the money or the justice is fully reclaimed. The week after I received the hesitant call from her friend, everything started to fall into place. I felt the weight of the betrayal with every breath, the bitter scent of coffee in my apartment mingling with the faint, dusty aroma of old books on my shelves. I had learned to move carefully, to let my daughter believe she was still in control while quietly gathering every piece of information I could. It was a strange, unsettling kind of patience, like waiting for a storm to pass when you know it's coming, yet savoring the quiet before the lightning strikes. One morning, I decided to test her further. I called her casually, discussing mundane things, the weather, my favorite shows, little errands. I let my voice carry warmth and familiarity, hiding the storm of suspicion brewing beneath. And as always, she responded with practiced cheerfulness, unaware that I already knew about her little network, her secret plans, her laughter about my $350,000 fund. I could hear the faint clink of dishes in the background, a sound so ordinary it almost lulled me, but I was too seasoned to let that distract me. Every detail mattered. The tone of her voice, the pauses, the tiny hesitations that betrayed nerves she didn't know I could detect. Then came the first major reveal, the one I hadn't anticipated. I was reviewing some digital transfers when I noticed a name that didn't belong. A friend she had involved in the plan, someone she had underestimated as well. I traced the transactions, piecing together a web of deceit that was larger than I imagined. There were purchases, deposits, even small bribes intended to keep people quiet. And in the midst of this chaos, I found the first hint of a human flaw. Fear. She was terrified of exposure, but her arrogance had blinded her. She thought she had planned everything perfectly. In reality, she had left a trail that only a patient observer could see. I remember sitting in my kitchen, the sunlight hitting the worn wood of the table, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of toast in the air, and feeling a cold clarity. Betrayal is one thing, but knowledge is power. I realized that confronting her outright, screaming, or reacting with immediate anger would only push her further into defensive lies. No, I needed subtlety, strategy, and timing. I needed to make her feel the weight of her choices without me losing mine. Over the next few days, I set small traps. I sent messages that hinted I was monitoring things more closely than I let on. I made quiet inquiries with her bank, careful not to tip my hand. I documented everything meticulously. And then, as expected, she made a mistake. A text sent to the wrong person, an email misaddressed, a hint that her network of accomplices wasn't as airtight as she believed. Each small error was a micro-victory, a crack in the facade she had built around her scheme. But here's the morally complex part. I realized that I could crush her financially and legally, but I didn't want to destroy her entirely. She was my daughter. She had made grave mistakes, yes, and she needed to be held accountable. But vengeance that consumes you as much as the target rarely feels like triumph. So I adjusted my plan. I would protect the $350,000, reclaim what was mine, and expose her actions in a way that allowed her a chance to make amends, if she was willing. The pivotal moment came one quiet evening. I invited her over under the pretense of discussing routine matters, keeping the apartment calm, the coffee warm, the cookies freshly baked, little sensory details that masked the storm to come. I didn't start with anger. Instead, I let the conversation drift naturally, until she mentioned, almost casually, that she thought she had everything handled. That was the trigger. I remained calm, sipping my coffee, feeling the bitterness on my tongue, the warmth of the mug in my hands. Then, gently, I asked about the fund. She froze, the faint smell of her perfume sharp in the air, the light from the kitchen casting shadows on her face. And then she confessed, not all at once, not in a neat, clean explanation, but in fragments, small admissions, hints, and evasions. The friend she involved, the purchases, the transfers, it all came spilling out, the arrogance giving way to fear, the laughter replaced with panic. I listened quietly, letting her words settle like dust in the sunlight, observing her, not interrupting, letting her realize that she had underestimated me. Every confession was a victory of awareness, a reclaiming of the respect and control I had thought lost. By the end, the full scope of her betrayal was clear. But so was my response. I calmly outlined the steps we would take to rectify the situation: partial restitution, legal acknowledgement, and a carefully documented plan that would protect my remaining funds. No yelling, no threats, just truth, strategy, and accountability. She left the apartment that evening pale, shaken, and aware that the $350,000 was safe, that her actions had consequences, and that I was no longer a passive participant in my own life story. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking under me, the faint smell of my coffee lingering, and felt a strange mix of relief and lingering sorrow. Betrayal leaves scars that aren't visible, ones that linger in quiet moments, in the hum of a refrigerator, in the warmth of a mug. I had reclaimed what was mine, yes, but I had also learned a lesson in patience, observation, and the delicate balance between justice and compassion. Sometimes, the most powerful victories are the ones that preserve both dignity and family, even when the trust that once seemed unbreakable has been shattered. The days that followed felt oddly quiet, almost surreal. The tension that had lodged itself in my chest like a stone began to loosen, though the memory of betrayal lingered, like the faint smell of burnt toast in a kitchen long after breakfast. My daughter had left my apartment that evening with a face pale and tense, aware of the consequences of her actions. She understood finally that I wasn't just the old man she thought she could manipulate. I was someone who had seen, calculated, and quietly reclaimed control. I spent a lot of time reflecting in the mornings, sipping coffee that had grown bitter over years of habit, letting the warmth seep into my hands as I watched the sunlight fall across the floorboards. The apartment smelled faintly of old paper, of leather, of life that had been lived fully and hard. And in those quiet moments I realized that the real victory wasn't just about the $350,000. It was about awareness, about understanding human nature, about recognizing the fragility of trust and the strength that comes from measured patience. The next step, of course, was to formalize what I had uncovered. I called my lawyer, a man whose office smelled of pipe smoke and polished wood, and walked him through every digital breadcrumb, every micro-twist, every piece of evidence that had emerged from my daughter's carelessness. We drafted documents that protected my funds, ensured restitution, and created a legal acknowledgement of the breach, all without shattering the fragile possibility of family reconciliation. It was a delicate balance, like walking along a narrow path over a river swollen with hidden currents. But life, as always, has its little surprises. One evening, weeks later, I received a short handwritten note slipped under my apartment door. No signature, just words. "I'm sorry. I understand now." I smiled faintly, the paper smelling faintly of perfume she had left behind months ago, and realized that sometimes human beings need space to recognize their own failings. The apology wasn't dramatic, wasn't full of tears or theatrics, but it was honest. And honesty, even delayed, is a currency more valuable than money. I didn't let my daughter off the hook entirely. There were conversations, careful explanations about boundaries, about respect, about the consequences of actions. And through it all, I noticed something remarkable. She listened, really listened. There was no laughter, no attempts to minimize, no bravado. Just attention and a willingness, tentative, awkward, but genuine, to acknowledge the pain she had caused. And for me, that was a different kind of victory, one that no court order or financial restitution could achieve. In the evenings, I often sit in my chair by the window, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, the faint smell of coffee lingering, the air tinged with the coolness of approaching night. I think about trust, betrayal, and the strange, unpredictable ways life tests us. I think about the quiet lessons, patience, observation, the ability to act without rage, that allow you to survive and sometimes even thrive after the sharpest sting. And I think about my daughter, who will now carry the memory of her choices and hopefully the wisdom to do better. There's a subtle irony here. The $350,000, which had seemed so central to the story, was always secondary to the human truths it revealed. Money can be stolen, mismanaged, or manipulated, but dignity, awareness, and quiet control, these are harder to take, harder to betray. I reclaimed my funds, yes, but I also reclaimed a sense of agency that betrayal had threatened to snatch from me, and that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of all. Sometimes I share these stories not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for reflection. I want people to hear the truths of life, that betrayal can come from the people you love most, that patience can be more powerful than anger, that justice doesn't always mean punishment, and that even in the darkest moments, dignity and clarity can prevail. Life teaches us, through pain and observation, through mistakes and tiny victories, what it truly means to survive and to grow. So here's my 2 cents, something I've learned over decades. Trust cautiously, observe carefully, and act deliberately. Keep your wits about you, even when your heart is aching, because sometimes the quiet, thoughtful moves are the ones that preserve both your life and your dignity. And remember, betrayal often reveals more about the betrayer than it does about you. But it also shows you just how strong you can be when faced with the unexpected. If you stick around in this corner of stories, I promise you won't just hear tales of deception or heartbreak. You'll hear lessons, little sparks of wisdom gleaned from the lives of people who have lived, erred, and sometimes quietly triumphed. There's more ahead, more lessons, more truths, and even more reminders that life is messy, unpredictable, and full of hard-earned wisdom. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, listen closely, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find a bit of insight you can carry into your own life.